welcome to Quiet Chronicles. I'm glad you're here, wherever tonight finds you. Let the day fall away from you now, the noise of it, the weight of it. Get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let your body sink into whatever is holding you right now, because we have a long night of history ahead, and there is nowhere else you need to be. He was the son of a tanner's daughter, born in a town that had no reason to remember him, and for the first years of his life the only thing anyone agreed on was that he would not last. Bastard born, surrounded by men who wanted him dead before he could walk, William of Falaise should have been a footnote. Instead, he became the last man to conquer England, and he did it by surviving almost everyone who tried to stop him along the way. If this kind of history helps you drift off, consider subscribing, and if someone in your life would enjoy a night like this one, pass it along. For those who'd like to support the channel further, there's a Patreon link in the description. By the time he was 7 years old, William had already buried the only parent who wanted him alive. What came after was not a childhood, it was a decade-long assassination attempt, one conspiracy after another, until the boy who should have died became a man nobody could kill. Tonight we follow that story from the beginning, from Falaise to Normandy, to a crown seized in blood, and finally to a death so undignified that the men in the room left before his body was even cold. Let's begin where he did, with almost nothing. Chapter 1: The Bastard of Falaise. Falaise sat on a spur of granite in lower Normandy, built around a keep that watched over the valley below it. In the autumn of 1027, or perhaps the following year, a boy was born there. Chroniclers never agreed on the exact date, and history has long since stopped trying to force one. That boy would grow up to redraw the map of two countries, though nothing about his birth suggested it. His father was Robert, second son of Duke Richard II of Normandy, a young man not yet duke and not yet burdened by any need for an heir. His mother was Herleva, said to be the daughter of a tanner, or perhaps an undertaker, depending on which chronicler is trusted. She belonged to the town of Falaise, not to the court above it. There was no marriage between them. There would never be one, and the absence of that ceremony would follow her son for the rest of his life. The boy history remembers as William the Conqueror was known, for much of his youth, by a far harsher name: William the Bastard. It was not an insult so much as a plain description, stated by a society that measured a man's claims almost entirely by the circumstances of his birth. Illegitimacy was not a private embarrassment in 11th century Normandy. It was a public fact, weighed openly against any inheritance a man might claim. Robert became Duke of Normandy in 1027, after his older brother Richard III died without warning. Poison, some whispered, though nothing was ever proven, and rumors of that kind clung easily to sudden deaths among Norman nobility. He ruled for 8 years afterward, keeping the duchy's borders intact against the French crown to the south, and holding its barons mostly in check. It was not a spectacular reign. It was, by most measures, a competent one. He never married Herleva, and he never married anyone else either. Whether from continued attachment to her, or simple indifference to the matter, or the plain fact that no suitable match ever materialized, Robert reached his 20s without a legitimate heir. William was what he had. So when the pilgrimage fever sweeping through Europe in the 1030s reached Robert as well, and he announced his intention to travel to Jerusalem, the succession became a problem that could no longer wait. Before departing, Robert gathered his barons and did something extraordinary. He made them swear fealty to his illegitimate son as heir to the duchy, a boy of 7 or 8 with no royal blood through his mother and no experience of governing anything. Many of the barons swore with open reluctance. A few, according to later accounts, barely bothered to hide their contempt for the arrangement. Illegitimacy alone was not always disqualifying under Norman custom, and that mattered here. The duchy had been founded generations earlier by Viking raiders turned settlers, men for whom continental ideas about legitimate birth carried far less weight than a leader's raw capability. Still, a child that young, born to a woman from the tanning quarter of a garrison town, was a harder case for the barons to swallow. Their oaths, sworn under pressure from a departing duke, were fragile from the moment they were spoken. Robert left for Jerusalem regardless, and he never returned. He died on the journey home near the city of Nicaea in the summer of 1035. Word of his death crossed Europe slowly, carried by merchants and returning pilgrims, and it reached Normandy only weeks after the fact. By the time it did, the duchy had already lost its duke. In his place, it now had a child. What followed has been described by historians since as one of the most dangerous childhoods any future king ever survived, and the description holds up under scrutiny. Normandy in this era belonged to whoever could hold it by force, not to whoever held the strongest legal claim. The barons who had sworn loyalty to a 7-year-old, most of them reluctant even at the moment of swearing, proved entirely willing to abandon that oath the instant it became inconvenient. William's guardians began dying, one after another in the years that followed. A tutor, a steward, a series of men appointed by the ducal council to protect the boy and manage Normandy in his name, each removed by assassination or by poison that was suspected but never confirmed. One guardian was killed in the very chamber where William slept, close enough that the boy reportedly heard the violence unfold in the dark. He was moved constantly through these years, passed between the households of relatives and retainers, still loyal enough to shelter him, never allowed to stay anywhere long enough to become an easy target. His great-uncle, Archbishop Robert of Rouen, offered real protection for a time, using the weight of the church to shield the boy in ways that secular power alone could not guarantee. That protection held until 1037, when the archbishop died. After that, the shelter around William grew noticeably thinner. Barons across the duchy used the absence of firm authority to settle old scores and expand their own holdings, and private wars spread across the countryside almost unchecked. Unauthorized castles rose in the countryside, built by lords with no intention of answering to a child duke, let alone to anyone claiming to govern on his behalf. Normandy remained unified only on paper. In practice, it had become a patchwork of competing lordships, each testing exactly how far it could push before someone pushed back. It would be tempting, looking backward from everything William eventually became, to treat this childhood as simple preparation, as though history were quietly forging a weapon in the shape of a boy. That reading flattens something far less certain and far more dangerous than it sounds in hindsight. There was no guarantee in the years after 1035 that William would live to see adulthood at all. Several of the men charged with protecting him were killed for doing nothing more than standing close enough to share his danger. He grew up watching loyalty prove itself hollow again and again, watching men who had sworn solemn oaths abandon them the moment abandonment turned profitable. Whatever calculating hardness would later define his rule as Duke and King had roots sunk deep into these years, when trust was a luxury he could rarely afford and rarely received. This was not a boy raised to expect loyalty. This was a boy raised to survive its absence. By his early teenage years, William had outlasted the worst of the immediate danger, even as the duchy around him remained badly fractured. King Henry I of France, still young himself and wary of instability along his northern border, began taking a personal interest in the boy's survival. It was not generosity that motivated him. A Normandy consumed by endless civil war was simply a far worse neighbor than a Normandy under even a weak, nominal duke loyal to the French crown. Henry personally knighted William at some point during his adolescence, formally placing the obligations of knighthood onto the shoulders of a young man who had spent most of his conscious life avoiding assassination rather than training for command. It was an unusual foundation on which to build a future king. Protection extended not from warmth, but from calculation, an education built largely through survival rather than instruction, loyalty modeled almost entirely by its repeated failures. William entered his teenage years still Duke in name only, still surrounded by barons who had not yet decided whether his rule deserved genuine respect or merely convenient silence. He lacked the military experience, the personal authority, and the seasoned allies needed to enforce his claim beyond whatever protection Henry's interest happened to provide. The duchy was his by inheritance. It was not yet his by any measure that mattered on the ground. Normandy waited, in other words, to see what kind of man the Bastard of Falaise would eventually become, and whether he would survive long enough to answer that question himself. The barons who had murdered his guardians, carved up his lands, and built their private fortresses without permission had no particular reason to believe the boy posed them any lasting threat. They were about to discover over the years that followed exactly how wrong that assumption was. Chapter 2: A Boy Among Wolves. Survival for William had become a kind of profession by the early 1040s, practiced daily rather than achieved once and forgotten. He was a teenager now, still duke in title, still the nominal ruler of a duchy that had never fully accepted him. The disorder that followed his father's death had not resolved with time. It had simply calcified into something the Norman nobility had learned to live inside, a low, constant hum of danger that never quite escalated into full catastrophe and never quite faded either. Osborne the steward stood among the handful of men who had taken on the daily burden of keeping William alive. He slept near the young duke each night, a precaution born of hard necessity after so many earlier guardians had died in their sleep. The precaution failed him. A conspirator entered the chamber under cover of darkness and cut Osborne's throat while he lay beside William, close enough that blood is said to have reached the boy himself. Whoever ordered the killing wanted a message delivered, and the message was unmistakable. William's title protected him from almost nothing. Sources disagree on exactly who stood behind that particular plot, and the disagreement itself says something true about the period. Conspiracies against William rarely traced back to a single source. Norman barons had spent years probing the limits of what a child duke could actually enforce, and the answer kept arriving the same way, over and over. Some hoped to control him outright, ruling Normandy through a puppet too young and too powerless to resist. Others preferred him removed entirely, cleared away so a more convenient heir could step into his place. Guy of Burgundy became one of the sharper threats to emerge during these years, a cousin of William's through the ducal bloodline with a legitimate claim of his own to press. The two had been raised together for a stretch of childhood, which lent Guy's eventual betrayal a particular bitterness that outsiders could not fully appreciate. He drew support from barons across western Normandy, men who resented centralized ducal authority on principle and viewed William as weak enough to be pushed aside. What had once been scattered, opportunistic violence against William was beginning, under Guy's ambition, to take the shape of organized rebellion. Flight defined much of William's adolescence in ways that would have been unthinkable for a duke ruling in more settled times. He shifted between households constantly, often traveling with only a small guard, relying on distant relatives and loyal retainers whenever his own strength proved insufficient to guarantee his safety. One frequently repeated account, never fully verified but consistent across several chronicles, describes a night when a warning reached William just moments before assassins arrived, forcing him to flee his lodging in darkness with almost no preparation. Whether every detail of that story holds up matters less than what it captures about the shape of his youth. This was an adolescence built around escape, not governance. Henry I of France remained an important presence throughout these years, though his motives had nothing to do with personal loyalty to William. Whatever Henry offered came wrapped in calculation rather than warmth. He understood clearly that a Normandy dissolving completely into civil war would eventually send instability spilling across his own southern border. A weak Norman duke who owed him allegiance suited Henry far better than a Normandy with no functioning authority at all, and that cold arithmetic kept a French army within reach whenever William's situation grew desperate enough to require one. Whatever education William received during these years bore little resemblance to the courtly refinement typically expected of a young noble. There was scarcely time for it. He learned instead to read danger in a room before stepping into it, to judge quickly which men could be trusted for a season and which could never be trusted at all, and to expect that alliances forged under pressure would rarely survive the pressure's passing. It was schooling built entirely on necessity, and its lessons left marks that never really faded from him. He also grew physically into a man of considerable size and strength, a detail chroniclers return to often enough that it clearly mattered to contemporaries. In a world where personal combat still settled disputes politics could not resolve, that size was more than incidental. William trained with real intensity, aware on some level that his continued survival might eventually rest on his own ability to fight, rather than on the loyalty of others. Skill with a blade was not decoration for a man in his position. It functioned as insurance. The barons arrayed against William were never a single coordinated faction, and that fact made the danger surrounding him harder to anticipate rather than easier. Some opposed ducal authority as a matter of principle, viewing any strengthened central power as a threat to their own local dominance. Others carried specific grievances rooted in land disputes or family feuds that predated William's birth by generations. A smaller group simply recognized opportunity in his weakness and moved to exploit it without much ideological reasoning behind the decision at all. Normandy's instability, in other words, was not one storm sweeping the duchy. It was dozens of smaller ones, overlapping unpredictably and occasionally merging into something larger. Through the middle years of the 1040s, the rebellious barons of western Normandy grew noticeably bolder, pushing well past assassination attempts and into open, visible defiance. Unauthorized fortifications rose across the western districts, garrisoned by men no longer bothering to disguise their contempt for William's authority. Several of these barons began coordinating directly with Guy of Burgundy, and the pattern of their communications suggested something more dangerous than the scattered, opportunistic violence that had marked William's early childhood. Disorder was hardening into strategy. William, meanwhile, was approaching a threshold every medieval noble eventually had to cross. There comes a point where a duke can no longer remain a boy shielded by others and must become a man capable of shielding himself, along with everyone who depended on him. Remaining a fugitive indefinitely was not a viable long-term position, not while his enemies consolidated their strength out in the open. Sooner or later, the balance would tip. Either William would assert real command over his own duchy, or the barons opposing him would finally succeed at what earlier conspirators had failed to accomplish. Later chroniclers, writing with full knowledge of everything William would eventually achieve, often described these years as a deliberate trial by fire, a forge shaping the future conqueror of England. That framing carries a comfortable sense of inevitability that the actual moment never possessed. Nothing about William surviving into adulthood was guaranteed, and nothing about his eventual mastery over the rebellious barons was assured in advance. At the time, he looked to most observers like a young duke of deeply uncertain prospects, pursued by men with more resources, more experience, and far less to lose. Some of the barons aligned against him held territory stretching across the Cotentin and Bessin regions, areas with a long-standing tradition of resisting ducal control that predated William's reign by decades. These lords had never fully accepted subjugation to Rouen even under stronger dukes, and William's uncertain legitimacy gave their resistance a fresh justification. Their independence was not simply defiance for its own sake. It reflected a genuine regional identity, one that saw itself as distinct from and equal to the ducal seat that claimed authority over it. By around 1046, the tension accumulating across western Normandy had reached a point where avoidance and concealment could no longer contain it. Guy of Burgundy's ambitions had hardened into open rebellion, and a considerable portion of the Norman baronage stood now in open alignment against their own duke. William, old enough by this point to be expected to lead rather than merely survive, faced a decision that had been approaching him quietly for years. He could keep running, extending an existence built on evasion indefinitely, or he could finally turn and face the men who had spent a decade trying to end his life. He turned. The choice would settle itself in the space of a single battle on a field near a river called Dunes, where the survival that had defined William's childhood would finally be tested against something far more decisive than a hidden blade in the dark. Chapter 3: Val-ès-Dunes. The plain near the River Orne, close to a stretch of ground later remembered as Val-ès-Dunes, was an unremarkable piece of Norman countryside for most of the year. In the summer of 1047, it became something else entirely. William, now roughly 19 years old, arrived there at the head of what forces he could muster, facing a coalition of rebel barons who had finally stopped hiding their intentions. This was not another ambush in a darkened bedchamber. It was open war fought in daylight, with both sides fully aware of what defeat would cost them. Guy of Burgundy led the rebellion, drawing his strength from the western reaches of Normandy, particularly the Cotentin and Bessin regions, where resentment of ducal authority ran deep and old. Several powerful barons had joined him, men whose families had resisted centralized control from Rouen for generations, long before William was even born. Their grievance was not really personal to William at all, though his uncertain legitimacy gave it a convenient focus. What they wanted was simple. They wanted a Normandy where their own power went unchallenged, and a weak or absent duke served that goal far better than a strong one. William understood by this point that his own forces alone would not be enough to secure victory. Years of surviving assassination attempts had taught him to calculate risk with unusual precision, and the math here was unfavorable without outside help. He turned to Henry I of France, the same king who had knighted him years earlier and who had long recognized that a stable, loyal Normandy served French interests better than a fractured one. Henry agreed to march north with his own troops, not out of affection for William, but because a Normandy ruled by openly rebellious barons posed a far greater danger to France than one ruled by a duke who owed him allegiance. The combined force of Norman loyalists and French troops met the rebel coalition on the plain near Val-ès-Dunes on a summer day in 1047, and the battle that followed was fierce, chaotic, and by the standards of the time, genuinely significant. Cavalry clashed across open ground in the kind of engagement that 11th century warfare rarely produced with such clarity. There was no ambiguity about what each side was fighting for. One side wanted William destroyed. The other wanted him confirmed once and for all as Duke in more than name. Accounts of the battle itself vary in their details, as accounts of medieval battles almost always do, shaped by chroniclers writing decades later with their own loyalties and their own reasons to shade the story one way or another. What survives across most versions is a picture of William fighting directly in the thick of the engagement, rather than commanding safely from a distance. This was not incidental to his reputation. a duke who fought alongside his men, who risked the same blade and the same arrow they did, earned a different kind of loyalty than one who watched from a hilltop. The rebel forces broke under the pressure of the combined attack, and the collapse, once it started, appears to have been rapid. Some of the fleeing rebels drowned attempting to cross the Orne in their retreat, weighed down by armor and water that offered no mercy to men in full panic. Guy of Burgundy himself escaped the immediate slaughter, though his position as a serious rival to William's rule effectively ended on that field, even if his personal resistance dragged on a while longer from behind the walls of a fortress before he was finally forced to submit. For William, the victory at Val-ès-Dunes marked a genuine turning point, arguably the first moment in his life when strength rather than survival defined his position. He had spent more than a decade running from men who wanted him dead, hiding in unfamiliar households, losing guardians to knives in the dark. Now, for the first time, he had met a coalition of his enemies in open battle and broken them decisively. The psychological weight of that shift mattered as much as the tactical one. William was no longer simply the boy who managed to stay alive. He was becoming a duke capable of enforcing his own authority by force when persuasion failed. The aftermath of the battle reshaped the internal politics of Normandy in ways that extended well beyond the immediate defeat of Guy's coalition. Barons who had previously calculated that a young, vulnerable duke could be safely ignored or manipulated now had to reconsider that assumption entirely. William had demonstrated both the will and the capacity to crush organized rebellion, and that demonstration rippled outward across the duchy, altering the calculations of lords who had never directly participated in the uprising, but had been watching closely to see how it resolved. William did not simply accept the surrender of defeated rebels and move on without consequence. Several rebel strongholds were destroyed in the campaign that followed the battle, their fortifications leveled as a clear signal that unauthorized castle building, so common during the chaotic years of his minority, would no longer be tolerated. This was an early sign of a pattern that would define much of William's later rule, in Normandy and eventually in England as well. He was not a duke inclined toward half measures once he held the upper hand. The victory also strengthened William's relationship with the church in Normandy, an institution that had generally favored stability and centralized authority over the endless private wars that had characterized the duchy during his minority. Ecclesiastical leaders had their own reasons to prefer a strong duke capable of enforcing peace, since monasteries and church lands were frequent targets of the very baronial violence that had plagued Normandy for years. William's success at Val-ès-Dunes gave the church a ruler it could work with, and that relationship would prove useful to him repeatedly in the years ahead. It would be a mistake, though, to treat Val-ès-Dunes as though it instantly transformed Normandy into a peaceful, unified duchy under William's firm control. The battle broke the specific coalition led by Guy of Burgundy, and it broke it decisively. It did not eliminate every source of resistance to William's rule, nor did it end the broader pattern of regional lords testing the limits of ducal authority whenever opportunity presented itself. What Val-ès-Dunes did accomplish was narrower but still crucial. It proved that William could win. In the years immediately following the battle, William began consolidating his position with a deliberateness that had been impossible during the chaos of his childhood. He worked to establish clearer lines of authority across the duchy, rewarding barons who had supported him at Val-ès-Dunes and moving carefully against those who had not, without triggering another full-scale uprising in the process. This was delicate work, requiring a different kind of skill than the battlefield had demanded. Military victory had won him the field. Political skill would be required to hold what he had won. Henry I's role in securing the victory did not go unnoticed within Normandy, and it left William in a position of genuine, if uncomfortable, debt to the French crown. For a duke who valued independence as much as William clearly did, owing his survival to French intervention was not an entirely comfortable arrangement. That discomfort would surface again in the years ahead, as the relationship between Normandy and France shifted from cooperation toward something closer to rivalry, once William no longer needed Henry's army to remain alive. The significance of Val-ès-Dunes extended beyond Normandy's borders as well, quietly reshaping how other rulers in the region viewed the young duke. A man who had survived a childhood defined by assassination attempts and constant flight, and who had then won a decisive battlefield victory against an organized coalition of his own nobility, was no longer someone to be dismissed as an unstable irrelevance. William was becoming a figure other powers needed to factor into their own calculations, whether as a potential ally or as a genuine threat. By the close of the 1040s, William stood in a position his childhood self could scarcely have imagined surviving to see. He was Duke of Normandy, not merely by inheritance or by the reluctant oaths of frightened barons, but by demonstrated force and growing political competence. The years of hiding, of losing guardians to hidden blades, of moving from household to household under constant threat, had given way to something sturdier. Normandy was not yet fully at peace, but for the first time in William's life, he stood at its center as something more than a target. Chapter 4. The Duke Consolidates. Victory at Val-ès-Dunes had given William something he had never possessed before, a genuine claim to authority backed by demonstrated force. What it had not given him was permanence. Battles won on a single afternoon could be undone by a decade of neglect, and William, still only in his early 20s, understood that holding Normandy would require a different kind of campaign, one fought through marriages, alliances, and the slow, unglamorous work of governance rather than open combat. Marriage stood near the top of that agenda, and William's choice fell on Matilda, daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders. Flanders was no minor territory. It sat astride important trade routes and held real diplomatic weight across northern Europe, and a marriage alliance with its ruling house offered William something Normandy badly needed after years of internal chaos. It offered legitimacy through association, a connection to an established and respected line that could soften the lingering stigma of William's own illegitimate birth. The match, however, ran into an obstacle that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with church law. William and Matilda were related within a degree the church considered too close for marriage, and Pope Leo IX formally forbade the union when it was first proposed. The prohibition was not a minor technicality easily brushed aside. Papal authority carried real weight in the 11th century, and defying it risked excommunication, a punishment that could isolate a ruler both spiritually and politically in ways far more damaging than a lost battle. William pursued the marriage anyway, and the couple wed around 1051 or 1052, the exact date uncertain, in defiance of the papal ban. It was a bold decision and not without real cost. The marriage remained under a cloud of ecclesiastical disapproval for years, a persistent irritant that William could not simply ignore, given how much of his authority depended on the Church's cooperation rather than its hostility. Resolution came eventually, though not quickly. William and Matilda undertook acts of penance to satisfy Rome, most notably funding the construction of 2 abbeys in Caen, one for men and one for women, as a visible demonstration of piety meant to offset the earlier defiance. Pope Nicholas II lifted the ban sometime around 1059, formally recognizing the marriage as valid. By then, William and Matilda had been together for the better part of a decade, and whatever awkwardness the papal dispute had caused seemed to matter less against the reality of an unusually stable and by most accounts genuinely affectionate partnership. Matilda herself proved to be far more than a political ornament attached to William's ambitions. She was capable, intelligent, and trusted enough that William repeatedly left her in charge of Normandy during his own absences, a level of responsibility rarely extended to noble women of the period, regardless of their birth. Their marriage produced numerous children, several of whom would go on to play significant roles in the future of both Normandy and England. It was, by the standards of medieval dynastic marriages, an unusually successful union built on more than mere strategic convenience. While the marriage question worked itself out over the course of the 1050s, William turned his attention to a problem that had plagued Normandy throughout his childhood and continued to threaten his authority even after Val-ès-Dunes. Unauthorized castle building had become endemic during the years of his minority, when barons across the duchy had thrown up private fortifications with no regard for ducal permission. Each of these castles represented a potential center of resistance, a physical fact on the ground that no amount of sworn loyalty could fully counteract. William moved methodically against this problem, demanding that unlicensed fortifications either be destroyed or brought formally under his authority. This was not a policy that could be enforced overnight, and it required a combination of military pressure and political negotiation applied consistently over years rather than months. Some barons complied without much resistance, recognizing after Val-ès-Dunes that defiance carried real consequences. Others required more direct persuasion, delivered through siege or the credible threat of one. The broader project underlying all of this was the transformation of Normandy from a collection of loosely connected, frequently warring lordships into something resembling a genuinely centralized duchy. William worked to establish clearer legal and administrative structures, strengthening ducal courts and asserting his right to adjudicate disputes that barons had previously settled through private warfare. This was slow, unglamorous work, largely invisible in the chronicles compared to battles and marriages, but it mattered enormously to the long-term stability of his rule. He also worked carefully to build a network of loyal supporters among the Norman nobility, rewarding those who had stood with him during the difficult years of his minority and at Val-ès-Dunes with land, offices, and marriages arranged to bind their families more closely to his own. Men like William Fitz-Osbern, whose father had been murdered protecting the young duke years earlier, rose to positions of real trust and influence. Loyalty, William had learned through hard experience, needed to be actively cultivated and rewarded, not simply assumed as a natural consequence of holding a title. The church, meanwhile, remained an essential partner in William's consolidation of power, and he cultivated that relationship with real deliberateness. Lanfranc, an Italian scholar and monk who had become prior of the abbey at Beek, emerged during this period as one of William's most important advisors, a man whose intellectual reputation and ecclesiastical connections proved invaluable, particularly during the awkward years of the papal marriage dispute. Their relationship would continue for decades, eventually extending into England itself once William's ambitions grew beyond Normandy's borders. Not every challenge to William's authority during this period came from within Normandy itself. Geoffrey Martel, the powerful Count of Anjou, represented an external threat that grew more serious as the decade progressed, probing Norman defenses and supporting rebellious elements within the duchy whenever the opportunity arose. Anjou's ambitions along Normandy's southern border would eventually draw William into direct military conflict, a confrontation that tested his growing strength against one of the most formidable rulers in the region. King Henry I of France, William's old protector, also grew warier of Norman strength as the 1050s wore on, and the relationship between the two men shifted noticeably from the cooperation that had won the day at Val-ès-Dunes. A weak, dependent Normandy had suited Henry's interests. A Normandy growing steadily more centralized, more secure, and more capable of acting independently suited them considerably less, and Henry began, cautiously at first, to support efforts aimed at checking William's expanding power. Despite these external pressures, the overall trajectory of Normandy under William during this period moved unmistakably toward consolidation and strength. The Duke, who had spent his childhood fleeing assassins, now presided over a duchy with functioning courts, a loyal core of nobility bound to him through land and marriage, unauthorized castles steadily brought to heel, and a stable marriage that had survived a papal prohibition to become one of the more solid partnerships of the age. None of this consolidation happened without cost or without ongoing resistance, and William would spend much of the coming decade fighting to defend what he had built, both against internal challengers who still tested his authority and against external rivals like Anjou and eventually France itself, who viewed a strengthening Normandy as a direct threat to their own ambitions. The Duke who emerged from this period of consolidation was harder, more capable, and considerably less forgiving than the frightened boy who had once fled his own bedchamber in the dark. Normandy, slowly and unevenly, was becoming his in more than name. Chapter 5: Domfront and Alençon. Geoffrey Martel, Count of Anjou, had spent years watching Normandy's southern border with the patient interest of a man waiting for weakness to show itself. He was one of the most formidable rulers in western France during this period, a count whose ambitions stretched well beyond his own territory and who had already clashed repeatedly with neighboring powers before William ever became a serious concern to him. As Normandy consolidated under its young duke through the 1050s, Geoffrey's attention turned increasingly toward the border regions where Norman and Angevin interests overlapped, particularly around the town of Domfront. Domfront sat in a contested stretch of territory in southern Normandy, its lord having placed himself under Angevin protection rather than Norman authority, a decision that effectively planted a hostile outpost inside land William considered his own. The arrangement could not stand indefinitely, not for a duke actively working to consolidate control over every corner of his duchy. William moved against Domfront around 1051, beginning what would become a prolonged and difficult siege against a fortress built high on a rocky outcrop, naturally defended in ways that made a quick resolution unlikely. The siege dragged on through a difficult winter, testing the endurance of William's forces as much as the fortress's defenses. Medieval sieges were rarely swift affairs, and Domfront's natural position made it particularly resistant to the kind of direct assault that might have ended matters quickly. William's army settled in for the long work of starving the garrison into submission, building siege works and maintaining the blockade through weather that made the whole campaign considerably more grueling than a single decisive battle would have been. While the siege of Domfront continued, William turned part of his attention toward Alençon, another contested town where local resistance to his authority had hardened into open defiance. What happened at Alençon would become one of the most frequently cited episodes of William's early reign, remembered less for its military significance than for what it revealed about the man directing the campaign. The garrison at Alençon, according to several chroniclers, mocked William's illegitimate birth during the siege, hanging or beating animal hides over the town walls while shouting insults about the tanner's grandson come to besiege honest men. The reference was deliberate and calculated to wound. William's mother's family had connections to the leather trade, and the insult reached directly into the wound that had shadowed him since childhood, the same accusation of low, illegitimate birth that had cost him guardians and nearly cost him the duchy itself. Whatever calm William might have maintained through other provocations apparently did not survive this one. His response, when it came, was swift and deliberately brutal, intended to close off any future temptation to repeat the insult. When Alençon eventually fell, William ordered the mutilation of a number of the townspeople involved in the mockery, reportedly having their hands and feet cut off as punishment for the insult they had directed at him. Chroniclers differ somewhat on the exact scale and details of the punishment, as they often do with atrocities from this period, but the consistency of the story across multiple sources suggests something genuinely severe occurred. This was not simply anger expressed in the heat of battle. It was a calculated demonstration, delivered with enough brutality that word of it would travel far beyond Alençon's walls. The message embedded in that punishment mattered as much as the punishment itself. William was signaling in the clearest terms available to a medieval ruler that his illegitimate birth was no longer a vulnerability to be exploited safely. Anyone tempted to mock him for it or to underestimate him because of it could now weigh that temptation against the fate of the people at Alençon. It was cruelty deployed with strategic precision, less an outburst of personal rage than a calculated investment in his own future reputation. Domfront eventually fell as well, worn down by the long siege rather than taken by direct assault, and its surrender alongside Alençon's marked a significant expansion of William's effective control over southern Normandy. Geoffrey Martel, watching his influence in the region collapse, could do little to reverse the outcome in the immediate term. The campaign had cost William time and resources, but it had also demonstrated something important about his capabilities as a military commander, extending well beyond the battlefield success he had already shown at Val-ès-Dunes. These campaigns established a pattern that would recur throughout William's career, in Normandy and later in England as well. He was capable of patience when patience served his purposes, as the long siege of Domfront demonstrated, willing to grind through a difficult winter rather than risk a costly direct assault against strong defenses. He was equally capable of sudden, calculated brutality when circumstances called for it, as the punishment at Alençon showed with brutal clarity. Neither approach reflected impulsiveness. Both reflected a mind working carefully toward specific, deliberate outcomes. Word of what had happened at Alençon spread through Normandy and beyond its borders, and the effect on William's reputation was significant, if not entirely comfortable for those who had to deal with him afterward. Other towns and fortresses along contested borders took note of what resistance combined with insult could bring down upon them. Some would later surrender more readily than they might otherwise have done, weighing the fate of Alençon's mutilated townspeople against the cost of continued defiance. Fear, William seemed to understand instinctively, could function as a tool of governance almost as effectively as loyalty. Geoffrey Martel did not simply accept the loss of influence in southern Normandy without further contest, and skirmishes and tension along the Norman-Angevin border continued for years after Domfront and Alençon fell. The broader rivalry between Normandy and Anjou would remain a persistent feature of William's reign, flaring periodically whenever either side saw an opening to press an advantage. William, though, had established through these campaigns that Norman territory taken by outside powers or granted to rebellious local lords would not simply be tolerated indefinitely. The military successes of this period also reinforced William's standing among his own nobility, many of whom had fought alongside him during these campaigns, and returned with a clearer sense of what kind of duke they now served. A leader capable of sustaining a difficult winter siege, and equally capable of the kind of brutal reprisal delivered at Alençon, commanded a particular kind of respect distinct from mere loyalty. It was respect rooted partly in genuine admiration and partly in something closer to fear, and William seemed content to let both motivations do their work. Historians examining this period have sometimes debated how much of the Alençon story reflects precise historical fact versus later chronicler embellishment, a caution worth holding on to given how often medieval sources shaded events to suit later political purposes. What remains difficult to dispute, regardless of the exact details, is the broader reputation William carried forward from these years. He became known increasingly as a duke who did not forget insults and who possessed both the will and the capability to answer them in ways designed to be remembered. This reputation would follow William for the rest of his life, shaping how allies and enemies alike approached dealings with him in the years ahead. It was a reputation built deliberately through episodes like Alençon, rather than one that simply accumulated by accident around a violent age. William understood, perhaps more clearly than most rulers of his generation, that a reputation for calculated ruthlessness could accomplish things that armies alone could not, deterring rebellion before it started and encouraging surrender before a costly siege became necessary. By the mid-1050s, the southern border of Normandy stood considerably more secure than it had been at the start of the decade. The immediate threat from Geoffrey Martel, contained if not entirely eliminated, and William's authority extended more firmly across territory that had once slipped toward Angevin influence. The Duke, who had once fled his own guardians in the dark, now commanded campaigns capable of grinding down fortified towns through patient siege and answering insult with calculated, memorable cruelty. Normandy's enemies, both inside the duchy and along its borders, were learning to take William considerably more seriously than they once had. Chapter 6: The Oath at Bayeux. Sometime around 1064, or perhaps 1065, a ship carrying Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, ran into difficulty off the coast of Ponthieu, well north of Normandy proper, along the French coastline. The exact purpose of Harold's voyage has never been fully settled by historians, and Norman and English sources describe his intentions quite differently, each shaping the story to suit their own later interests. What is generally agreed upon is that Harold, at the time the most powerful nobleman in England after King Edward the Confessor himself, ended up shipwrecked or blown off course and fell into the hands of Guy, Count of Ponthieu. Guy recognized immediately what kind of prize had washed into his territory. Noble captives were valuable commodities in this period, held for ransom or leveraged for political advantage, and an earl as powerful as Harold represented an unusually lucrative catch. Guy imprisoned him, presumably intending to extract a substantial ransom before releasing so significant a hostage. Word of Harold's capture spread quickly along the coast, and it was not long before it reached William, Duke of Normandy, who had his own reasons for taking a personal interest in the Earl's fate. William demanded that Guy hand Harold over to Norman custody, a request Guy could not easily refuse given the significant difference in power between a Duke of Normandy and a Count of Ponthieu. Guy complied, and Harold passed from one captor to another, though the nature of his circumstances shifted considerably in the transfer. Where Guy had held him as a prisoner awaiting ransom, William received him as something closer to an honored guest, at least outwardly, extending the kind of hospitality expected between men of comparable rank, rather than the treatment typically given to a captive. What followed has been described by various chroniclers in ways that diverge sharply depending on which side of the channel the account originated from. Norman sources, writing after 1066 with an obvious interest in justifying William's later invasion, describe an extended stay during which Harold was treated with genuine warmth and generosity. He reportedly accompanied William on a military campaign into Brittany, fighting alongside Norman forces and even, according to some accounts, personally rescuing Norman soldiers from danger during a difficult crossing of quicksand near Mont Saint-Michel. Whether every detail of this campaign reflects literal fact or later embellishment designed to bind Harold more closely to William's cause remains genuinely uncertain. The Bayeux tapestry, created within a few decades of these events, and commissioned almost certainly under Norman patronage, depicts this period of Harold's stay in vivid detail, including the Brittany campaign and the eventual ceremony that would define the entire episode's historical significance. The tapestry shows Harold, at some point during his time in Normandy, swearing an oath to William over sacred relics, his hands resting upon reliquaries containing what were believed to be genuine remains or artifacts of saints. This was not a casual gesture. An oath sworn on holy relics in the 11th century carried spiritual weight that extended well beyond ordinary political promise, binding the swearer's soul as much as his word. The exact content of Harold's oath has been debated by historians for centuries, and the debate matters enormously because everything that followed in 1066 hinged, at least in Norman eyes, on what precisely Harold had promised. Norman sources are consistent in claiming that Harold swore to support William's claim to the English throne after Edward the Confessor's death, acting as William's representative in England and working to secure the crown for the Norman Duke rather than pursuing it himself. If accurate, this would mean Harold had personally, and under sacred oath, committed himself to placing William on the English throne. English sources understandably tell a rather different story, or at least frame the circumstances of the oath in ways that undercut its binding force. Some accounts suggest Harold's agreement, whatever its exact wording, was extracted under conditions that made genuine consent questionable at best. He was, after all, a captive of sorts when the events began, dependent on William's goodwill for his eventual return to England, and a man in that position might reasonably feel compelled to say whatever was necessary to secure his release, regardless of his private intentions once he was safely home. There is also the matter of what authority Harold actually possessed to make such a promise in the first place. He was Earl of Wessex, immensely powerful and closely connected to King Edward, but he was not king himself, and the English succession, at least according to English custom, was not simply his to promise away on William's behalf. The Wheaton, the council of English nobles and clergy responsible for confirming a new king, held real authority over succession matters that no single earl, however powerful, could unilaterally override through a personal oath sworn on foreign soil. Regardless of these complications, William treated the oath, once sworn, as an absolutely binding commitment, and this interpretation would become the foundation of his entire justification for the invasion that followed 2 years later. In William's telling, and in the telling of the Norman chroniclers who wrote in service of his later reign, Harold had freely and knowingly sworn to support William's claim, understanding fully what the oath entailed, and had therefore committed an act of grave betrayal when he later took the throne for himself. The sanctity of the oath, sworn on relics before witnesses, gave William's cause a moral and religious dimension that pure dynastic ambition alone could not have provided. Harold eventually returned to England, released by William after the oath was sworn, carrying with him whatever private understanding he actually held about what he had promised and under what circumstances he considered himself bound by it. The two men parted, at least outwardly, on terms that suggested cooperation rather than impending conflict, though it seems unlikely either man fully trusted the other's future intentions. William had secured, in his own estimation, a critical piece of leverage over the English succession. Harold had secured his freedom and his return to a position of enormous influence in England, regardless of whatever he had sworn to achieve that outcome. The broader context surrounding this episode mattered enormously to how it would later unfold. King Edward the Confessor, ruling England since 1042, had no children, and the question of who would succeed him had been simmering for years by the time Harold's ship wrecked off Ponthieu. William believed he had a legitimate claim to the English throne himself, rooted in his distant blood relationship to Edward through the English king's Norman mother, and reinforced in William's own account by an earlier promise Edward had supposedly made, naming William as his intended heir. Harold's oath, whatever its true circumstances, fit into this larger pattern of William methodically building a case for his own succession. Whether Edward had truly promised the throne to William years earlier remains, like so much of this period, contested among historians working from incomplete and biased sources. Norman chroniclers insisted the promise had been made and was well known at the English court. English sources are considerably more skeptical, noting that English succession customs gave enormous weight to the Wheaton's approval and to established custom favoring candidates with stronger direct blood ties to the West Saxon royal line, a category that did not include William regardless of any private promise Edward might have made. What can be said with more confidence is that William, by the time Harold sailed back to England, believed he possessed both a dynastic claim and a personally sworn oath from the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom, and he regarded both as serious, legitimate grounds for pursuing the English crown when the moment came. This belief, whether entirely justified by the actual circumstances of Harold's captivity and oath or not, would prove decisive in shaping William's response once Edward finally died and the English succession was actually decided. A duke who felt genuinely wronged, his sacred oath betrayed, was a considerably more dangerous and determined adversary than one pursuing opportunistic conquest alone. The episode at Bayeux, brief as it was in the broader sweep of William's life, would echo through everything that followed over the next several years. It gave William a moral framework for the invasion he would eventually launch, allowing him to present himself not as a foreign conqueror seizing a throne by naked force, but as a wronged claimant enforcing a sacred oath that had been broken by an oath breaker. Whether Harold ever genuinely understood the oath in those terms, or whether he regarded it as a coerced promise, extracted under duress and therefore void, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that both men would soon find themselves on opposite sides of the most consequential conflict either would ever face. Harold returned to an England still ruled by an aging king, resuming his position as the most powerful earl in the kingdom. His influence over Edward and the machinery of English government scarcely diminished by his time across the Channel. William returned to the ongoing business of governing Normandy, watching events in England from a distance, waiting to see how the question of succession would ultimately resolve itself. Neither man could have known, in the immediate aftermath of the oath at Bayeux, exactly how soon that question would be forced, or how completely their two fates would come to depend on its answer. Chapter 7: Edward's Death, England's Choice. Edward the Confessor had ruled England for nearly a quarter century by the time his health began its final decline in late 1065, and the question that had shadowed his reign for years finally could not be postponed any longer. He was old by the standards of his age, childless despite a long marriage to Edith, daughter of the powerful Earl Godwin, and increasingly frail as the winter approached. England, in the meantime, had grown accustomed to a king who devoted much of his energy to piety and to the great abbey he was building at Westminster, leaving the practical business of governance largely in the hands of his most powerful earls, chief among them Harold Godwinson. Westminster Abbey itself was nearing completion as Edward's strength failed, and the timing carried a certain grim symmetry that later chroniclers would not fail to notice. The king who had poured so much of his reign into that building would not live to see it fully finished in the way he had envisioned, though he would live just long enough to witness its consecration. His final weeks were marked by illness that left him increasingly unable to attend to affairs of state, and the great men of the kingdom gathered around him, aware that his death would trigger a succession crisis with no clean or universally accepted resolution. Edward died on the 5th of January, 1066 at Westminster, and England found itself immediately confronted with the exact problem his reign had never definitively solved. There was no obvious heir waiting in the wings, no adult son with an unquestioned claim to step smoothly into his father's place. The nearest blood relative with any direct claim was Edgar the Atheling, a teenage grandson of a previous English king, but Edgar was young, inexperienced, and lacked the political base or personal authority needed to hold a kingdom together during a moment of real vulnerability. Into this vacuum stepped Harold Godwinson, and the speed of what happened next tells its own story about how prepared he was for this moment. The Wheaton, the assembly of English nobles and senior clergy, responsible for confirming royal succession, met and elected Harold as king with remarkable swiftness, so swiftly that some historians have wondered whether the decision had been effectively settled before Edward even drew his last breath. Harold was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the same day Edward was buried there, an almost startling compression of mourning and coronation into a single day's ceremony. The case for Harold's election, from an English perspective, was genuinely strong regardless of any oath sworn years earlier in Normandy. He was the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom, experienced in governance, respected by much of the nobility, and connected by marriage and family influence to a wide network of English earls whose cooperation any new king would desperately need. Some accounts even suggest Edward himself, in his final failing moments, had named Harold as his chosen successor, a deathbed designation that carried enormous symbolic weight even if it lacked the binding legal force of a formal act made years in advance. News of Harold's coronation reached William in Normandy within weeks, and by every account that survives, his reaction was one of genuine fury rather than mere political disappointment. Whatever calculation had gone into William's earlier cultivation of a claim to the English throne, the actual moment of Harold's crowning seems to have struck him as something closer to personal betrayal. This was, in William's understanding, the same man who had sworn a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim, now sitting on the throne William believed had been promised to him. William moved quickly to formalize his objections and build international support for a challenge to Harold's kingship, understanding that outrage alone would accomplish nothing without the resources and legitimacy needed to back it. He dispatched envoys to Rome, presenting his case to Pope Alexander II, framing Harold's coronation not merely as a political inconvenience, but as a violation of sacred oath, an act of perjury against God, as much as against William personally. This framing mattered enormously, because it transformed what might otherwise have looked like naked territorial ambition into something closer to a righteous cause deserving of papal blessing. The Pope's response proved crucial to everything that followed. Alexander II, after considering William's case, granted his support to the planned invasion, reportedly sending a consecrated papal banner to accompany William's forces when they eventually crossed the Channel. This endorsement carried significance far beyond simple moral cover. It meant William could present his invasion to his own barons and to the wider Christian world as something closer to a holy undertaking, a crusade of sorts against a perjured usurper, rather than as one ambitious duke's attempt to seize a foreign crown by force alone. Securing papal backing did not, by itself, guarantee William the army or the fleet he would need to actually cross the Channel and challenge Harold on English soil. Invading England was an enormously expensive undertaking, requiring ships built or acquired in significant numbers, soldiers recruited and equipped, and provisions gathered sufficient to sustain a major military campaign. William called together his barons and vassals, presenting them with his case and his intentions, and the response, while not unanimous, proved sufficient to set the invasion in motion. Some of William's own barons expressed real hesitation when the invasion was first proposed, uncertain whether the risks of such an ambitious undertaking justified the potential rewards. Crossing open water to invade a foreign kingdom was a fundamentally different proposition than the land campaigns Normandy's nobility had grown accustomed to fighting along their own borders. William addressed these concerns through a combination of persuasion and promise, offering land and titles in a conquered England to those who committed their resources and their swords to the enterprise, a promise that would prove enormously significant in shaping the character of English rule for generations afterward. Beyond Normandy's own borders, William worked to secure support and at least neutrality from neighboring powers whose intervention could otherwise complicate his plans considerably. His relationship with King Philip I of France, still a minor at the time with regents governing in his name, remained cautious but did not present an active obstacle to the invasion preparations. Other regional rulers, weighing their own interests, largely chose to watch rather than intervene, content to see how the contest between William and Harold would resolve itself before committing their own resources to either side. Harold, meanwhile, was not idle in England during these months, fully aware that William's fury in Normandy represented a genuine and growing threat to his new reign. He began organizing English defenses along the southern coast, anticipating that any Norman invasion would most likely land somewhere along the Channel coastline within reach of Normandy's own shores. Furred forces, the English system of levied troops drawn from the general population, were mustered and stationed to watch for signs of an approaching Norman fleet through the spring and summer months of 1066. Harold faced a second, and in some ways more immediately pressing threat as well, one that would complicate his defensive planning considerably in the months ahead. His own brother Tostig, who had previously served as Earl of Northumbria before being driven out amid widespread local rebellion against his harsh rule, harbored deep resentment toward Harold and had been seeking allies willing to support a challenge to his brother's new kingship. Tostig's grievances would soon draw a far more dangerous figure into England's unfolding crisis, one whose ambitions rivaled William's own. Through the summer of 1066, England existed in a state of tense anticipation, its southern defenses mustered and watching the Channel for any sign of Norman sails, while Harold worked simultaneously to secure his new throne against internal challenges and to prepare for whatever William might eventually attempt. The Fyrd could not remain indefinitely mobilized, however, drawn as it was from men needed for the autumn harvest, and the pressure to release these forces back to their farms grew steadily as the summer wore on, without any sign of William's invasion actually materializing. Across the Channel, William's own preparations moved forward with a thoroughness that reflected the enormous stakes involved, though they too faced delays that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with forces no medieval commander could fully control. Ships needed to be built or gathered from across Normandy's coastal regions, an undertaking of genuinely massive scale given the size of the force William intended to transport across open water. What awaited both men, though neither could have known it with certainty in the summer of 1066, was a year that would decide the fate of England through not one but two major battles, fought within days of each other by an exhausted English army caught between two determined invaders. Chapter 8: Building the Invasion. Assembling an invasion fleet in the 11th century was not simply a matter of ordering ships and waiting for them to appear. William's preparations through the spring and summer of 1066 drew on the resources of the entire duchy, with timber felled across Norman forests and shipwrights working along the coast at Dives-sur-Mer and elsewhere to construct a fleet large enough to transport thousands of men, their horses, and the equipment needed to sustain a full military campaign on foreign soil. Estimates of the fleet's eventual size vary considerably among historians, but even conservative figures describe several hundred vessels, an undertaking of genuinely staggering scale for a single duchy to produce within a matter of months. The soldiers William gathered for this campaign came from a wider pool than Normandy alone could provide, a fact that reflected both the scale of the undertaking and the appeal of William's promised rewards. Knights and adventurers arrived from Brittany, from Flanders, from various regions of France, and from other parts of the continent, drawn by the prospect of land and titles in a conquered England should the invasion succeed. This was not a purely Norman army in the strictest sense, though Norman forces and Norman leadership remained at its core. It was closer to a coalition of ambitious men from across northern Europe, united less by shared identity than by shared appetite for what victory might bring them. Provisioning an army of this size for an uncertain crossing and an unknown campaign presented logistical challenges that extended well beyond simply building enough ships. Horses required careful handling for a sea crossing, a genuinely difficult undertaking given how poorly medieval vessels were suited to transporting large animals across open water without significant losses. Food, weapons, and equipment All had to be gathered and stored in quantities sufficient to sustain the army once it landed, since a hostile England could not be relied upon to simply supply an invading force with what it needed. Papal support, secured earlier in the year through William's careful diplomatic case against Harold, provided the invasion with a spiritual dimension that proved genuinely useful in rallying support beyond Normandy's own borders. The consecrated banner sent by Pope Alexander II accompanied the fleet as a visible symbol that this campaign carried the Church's blessing, a detail that mattered enormously to knights weighing whether to risk their lives on an invasion of a foreign kingdom. Framing the campaign as righteous punishment for Harold's broken oath, rather than simple territorial ambition, gave the enterprise a moral clarity that helped William recruit far beyond what Norman resources alone could have supplied. By August of 1066, the fleet had gathered at Dives-sur-Mer, assembled and largely ready, waiting only for the winds needed to carry it safely across the Channel toward England's southern coast. What followed instead was weeks of frustrating delay, as unfavorable winds kept the invasion fleet pinned in harbor, while the summer campaigning season slipped steadily away. This was not a minor inconvenience. Every week of delay increased the strain on William's assembled forces, drained resources gathered for a much shorter wait, and pushed the eventual crossing dangerously close to the autumn storms that made channel crossings considerably more perilous. William eventually moved the fleet to St. Valery-sur-Somme, further along the coast, in hopes of finding more favorable conditions for the crossing, though even there the winds continued to work against him through much of September. Chroniclers writing later would sometimes frame this waiting period in providential terms, suggesting divine forces were deliberately holding William back until the moment proved right, a narrative that fit neatly with the broader Norman framing of the invasion as a righteous undertaking blessed by heaven. Whatever the actual cause, the delay would prove, entirely by accident, to work enormously in William's favor. While William's fleet sat immobilized by unfavorable winds along the Norman coast, a second and unexpected threat was gathering against Harold from an entirely different direction. Tostig, Harold's exiled brother, had spent months seeking allies willing to support his return to power in England, and he eventually found one in Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a legendary warrior whose reputation for military conquest stretched across much of northern Europe. Hardrada harbored his own claim to the English throne, rooted in a decades-old agreement between earlier Scandinavian and English rulers, and Tostig's grievances against his brother offered him a convenient pretext to press that claim by force. Hardrada assembled his own substantial invasion fleet, and in September of 1066, he and Tostig sailed for northern England with a force that included some of the most experienced warriors in Scandinavia. This was an invasion entirely separate from William's planned crossing, driven by its own ambitions and its own timeline, but its timing would prove critically important to everything that followed. Harold now faced the very real prospect of fighting two major invasions within the same season, one from Norway in the north and one from Normandy expected somewhere along the southern coast. The Norwegian fleet made landfall near the Humber estuary in early September, and Hardrada's forces began moving inland with the brutal efficiency of an army led by one of the era's most formidable military commanders. Local English resistance in the north proved unable to hold against the invaders, and Hardrada and Tostig won a significant victory at the Battle of Fulford near York on the 20th of September, defeating the northern earls Edwin and Morcar in a hard-fought engagement that left the city of York itself vulnerable to the invading force. Word of the Norwegian invasion and the defeat at Fulford reached Harold in the south with an urgency that forced an immediate and difficult decision. He had spent the summer watching the Channel for signs of William's fleet, his forces mustered and waiting along the southern coast for a threat that had not yet materialized. Now an entirely different invasion had struck in the north, one already inflicting real defeats and threatening to establish itself permanently in English territory if left unanswered. Harold could not simply ignore the threat and hope it resolved itself favorably without his intervention. He made his decision quickly, gathering what forces he could and beginning a forced march north toward York, covering the distance with a speed that impressed contemporaries and later historians alike, given the physical demands such a march placed on an army moving primarily on foot. This was not a leisurely repositioning of forces. It was a race against time, driven by the understanding that every day Hardrada's army remained unopposed in the north gave the invaders more opportunity to consolidate their gains and grow stronger. Harold's army moved with an urgency that reflected genuine crisis rather than routine military maneuver. The strategic bind Harold now found himself in was genuinely severe, regardless of how quickly or effectively he responded to it. Marching north to confront Hardrada meant leaving the southern coast, and William's still anticipated invasion without the concentrated defensive force that had been watching for it throughout the summer. There was no way to be in both places at once, no way to fight two major invasions simultaneously with a single army, however well led or however swiftly it could move between crises. Harold had to choose which threat to address first, and the choice, forced upon him by circumstance rather than preference, would shape everything that followed. Back in Normandy, William's fleet remained pinned by unfavorable winds even as these events unfolded across the Channel, a delay that had cost him weeks of the campaigning season and considerable strain on his assembled forces. He had no way of knowing, as September wore on, that the very winds keeping him ashore were inadvertently working in his favor, giving Hardrada's invasion time to strike first and draw Harold's attention and his army away from the southern coast entirely. What looked, through much of September, like a frustrating and possibly disastrous delay was quietly reshaping the entire strategic picture in William's favor, though he would not fully understand the extent of that advantage until events in the north had already run their course. The stage was now set for a sequence of events that would unfold with remarkable speed once it finally began, compressing what might otherwise have been a slower, more deliberate campaigning season into a matter of weeks. Harold's army was moving north to meet one invasion while William's fleet waited, still immobilized, for the winds that would finally let it cross toward a southern coast Harold's forces had been forced to abandon. Neither man could have fully anticipated how the coming weeks would unfold, nor how completely England's fate would come to depend on the exhausting sequence of battles that was about to begin. Chapter 9: Stamford Bridge. Harold's army covered the distance from the south of England to Yorkshire in a matter of days, a pace that has drawn admiration from military historians ever since. Given the physical demands such speed placed on men marching largely on foot across roughly 200 miles of English countryside. Along the way, he gathered additional troops from the regions his march passed through, supplementing the forces he had brought north from his southern muster. This was not a leisurely repositioning of an army. It was a race against the clock, driven by the understanding that every day Harald Hardrada's Norwegian force remained unopposed, gave the invaders more time to consolidate their position in the north. Hardrada, for his part, appears to have believed he had more time than he actually did. Following the victory at Fulford in late September, the Norwegian king and Tostig had turned their attention to receiving the submission of York and arranging for hostages and supplies from the surrounding region, a process that suggested confidence rather than urgency. There is little indication in the sources that Hardrada expected Harold to arrive from the south so quickly, and that miscalculation would prove costly almost beyond measure once the two armies finally met. The location chosen for the exchange of hostages and supplies was Stamford Bridge, a crossing point over the River Derwent a short distance from York, where Hardrada's forces gathered on the 25th of September to receive what they believed would be a routine handover from the surrounding countryside. Significantly, a substantial portion of the Norwegian army had left their armor back with the ships at recall, several miles away, a decision that reflected how little they anticipated any immediate threat. It was, by most accounts, an unusually warm day for late September, and the lack of expected danger made heavy armor seem an unnecessary burden to men expecting a peaceful gathering rather than a battle. What appeared instead, cresting the horizon with a speed that must have seemed almost impossible, was Harold's army, having completed its forced march from the south and arrived at Stamford Bridge with a suddenness that caught the Norwegian force almost entirely by surprise. The shock of that arrival cannot be overstated. An army that Hardrada believed to be days away, if it was coming at all, had somehow closed the distance and appeared ready for battle, while a significant portion of the Norwegian force stood unarmored on the wrong side of the river from their main camp and its stored equipment. The battle that followed unfolded in stages, beginning with a desperate Norwegian effort to regroup and consolidate their forces in the face of an enemy that had achieved near total surprise. One episode from the early fighting has become particularly famous in English retellings of the battle, describing a single Norwegian warrior who held the narrow bridge over the Derwent alone for a considerable time, cutting down English soldiers attempting to cross before finally being killed, reportedly by a spear thrust from beneath the bridge itself. Whether this account reflects precise historical fact or later embellishment, it captures something true about how fiercely contested the crossing proved to be. Once Harold's forces finally forced their way across the river, the battle shifted into open ground, where the advantages Harold's army had built through surprise and superior numbers began to assert themselves decisively. Hardrada, described by contemporaries as a warrior of enormous size and battlefield reputation built across decades of campaigning from Byzantium to Scandinavia, fought in the thick of the engagement himself rather than directing from a safe distance. He was killed during the fighting, reportedly struck in the throat by an arrow, and his death removed the single figure whose reputation and leadership had held the Norwegian invasion together. Tostig fought on after Hardrada's death, apparently offered terms by his brother Harold that might have ended the bloodshed, terms he refused according to several accounts, choosing instead to continue fighting alongside the remaining Norwegian forces. He too was killed before the battle finally ended, his rebellion against Harold concluding not in restored power, but in death on a battlefield far from the English territories he had once ruled. The personal dimension of this loss, an English king killing his own brother in battle, added a bitter note to what was otherwise, from Harold's perspective, an overwhelming and much-needed victory. The destruction of the Norwegian force at Stamford Bridge was close to total, one of the most decisive military victories of the entire period. Of the fleet that had carried Hardrada's invasion force to England, so few ships were needed to carry the survivors home that the scale of the defeat spoke for itself without requiring further commentary from any chronicler. This was not a battle that ended in negotiated withdrawal or partial retreat. It was a rout comprehensive enough that Scandinavian ambitions toward the English throne would not seriously resurface again for generations. For Harold, the victory at Stamford Bridge represented a genuine triumph, achieved through decisive leadership, remarkable speed of movement, and the kind of battlefield success that should have, under different circumstances, cemented his reputation as a formidable and capable king. He had faced one of the most celebrated warriors in Northern Europe, caught him by surprise through sheer determination and pace of march, and destroyed his invasion force almost entirely. Under ordinary circumstances, this would have been remembered as the defining achievement of his reign. Circumstances, however, were anything but ordinary, and the victory came at a cost that would prove to matter enormously in the days that followed. Harold's army had marched with extraordinary speed to reach Yorkshire, and then fought a hard, bloody battle immediately upon arrival, absorbing casualties among experienced soldiers who could not simply be replaced overnight. Exhaustion, in an army that had covered such distance and fought such a battle in rapid succession, was not a minor factor to be brushed aside. It represented a genuine depletion of the force's fighting capacity, one that would matter enormously against whatever challenge came next. And a new challenge was already approaching, even as Harold's men rested and tended their wounds in the aftermath of the northern victory. Word reached Harold within days that William's fleet, freed at last from the winds that had held it pinned along the Norman coast for weeks, had finally crossed the Channel and landed on the southern coast of England. The invasion Harold had spent the summer watching for and had been forced to leave undefended while marching north to meet Hardrada, had arrived at almost the precise moment Harold's exhausted army was least prepared to meet it. The timing could hardly have been worse for Harold, and it is difficult to avoid recognizing the strategic gift that the earlier delay had inadvertently handed to William. Had the winds cooperated in August as originally hoped, William's invasion might well have arrived while Harold's full, rested southern army stood ready and waiting along the coast, prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. Instead, the delay had allowed Hardrada to strike first, drawing Harold's army north into a punishing forced march and a brutal battle, and only then, once Harold's forces were spent and far from the southern coast, did William's fleet finally arrive. Harold now faced a decision that mirrored, in reverse, the one that had sent him racing north weeks earlier. His army, victorious but exhausted, needed rest and reinforcement it did not have time to properly receive. The threat in the south could not simply be ignored, not with a Norman army now ashore and beginning to establish itself in Sussex, raiding and fortifying territory that Harold could not afford to cede without contest. Once again, speed rather than caution defined Harold's response, and he began the long march back south almost immediately, gathering what additional troops he could along the way, while leaving many of his most seriously wounded and depleted units behind in the north. The strategic logic behind this rapid return south was understandable, even if it carried enormous risk. Harold had achieved surprise and decisive victory at Stamford Bridge through speed, and there was reason to hope similar swiftness might catch William equally unprepared, or at least prevent the Norman invasion force from expanding its foothold and gathering additional strength while Harold delayed his response. Whether this reasoning was sound, given the very different condition of his army after Stamford Bridge compared to before it, would become one of the most debated questions among historians examining the campaign that followed. What Harold could not fully account for, marching south with an army that had already given so much in the north, was the condition of the force he was bringing to meet William. These were men who had marched roughly 200 miles, fought a brutal battle, and were now being asked to march south again over a similar distance, with barely any opportunity to rest, resupply, or allow reinforcements to properly integrate into the ranks. It was an extraordinary demand to place on any army, however capable its leadership, and the consequences of that demand would become apparent within days, on a ridge near Hastings where William's forces waited. Chapter 10: The Crossing and Hastings. William's fleet finally caught favorable winds in late September of 1066, weeks later than originally planned, and the crossing that followed carried thousands of men, horses, and supplies across the Channel toward the English coast. The fleet made landfall at Pevensey on the 28th of September, an unopposed landing that must have come as something of a relief after so long spent waiting on winds that refused to cooperate. There was no English army waiting on the beach to contest the landing, a fact William could not have counted on, but one that worked entirely in his favor, given that Harold's forces were, at that very moment, still fighting or recovering from Stamford Bridge far to the north. William moved his forces from Pevensey to Hastings shortly after landing, a more defensible position along the coast, where he began fortifying a base of operations and, notably, sending raiding parties into the surrounding Sussex countryside. This raiding was not simply opportunistic plunder. It served a deliberate strategic purpose, provoking Harold into a hasty response by threatening land and people the English king could not afford to appear indifferent toward, particularly not so soon after claiming the throne through a contested succession. William understood that time spent waiting favored whichever side could better afford patience, and he had no intention of granting Harold the luxury of a slow, careful response. News of William's landing reached Harold within days of the Norman fleet's arrival, forcing the exhausted English king into the very decision his advisors had likely warned him against. Some sources suggest members of Harold's own council urged him to wait, to allow his battered army proper time to recover from Stamford Bridge, and to gather a larger, fresher force before confronting William directly. Harold, whether from a genuine belief that speed offered the best chance of catching William unprepared, or from an unwillingness to allow Norman raiders free rein over English subjects and territory, chose instead to march south immediately, gathering what additional troops he could along the way. The English army that assembled to meet William was, in composition, quite different from the standing professional forces later medieval kingdoms would field. Its core consisted of housecarls, elite, well-armed, and thoroughly trained warriors who served as Harold's personal retinue and that of his most powerful nobles, men whose skill with weapons like the fearsome two-handed Danish battle axe made them formidable opponents in close combat. Around this corps gathered the furred, levied troops drawn from the general population, varying enormously in their equipment and training depending on their social standing and the resources available to arm them. This was an army built around a hardened professional center, surrounded by a considerably less uniform periphery. Harold positioned his forces on Senlac Hill, a ridge that offered genuine tactical advantages for a defensive battle, its slopes rising steeply enough to blunt the effectiveness of any cavalry charge launched against it. The English formation adopted what chroniclers describe as a shield wall, a dense, disciplined line of overlapping shields presenting an almost solid barrier to attackers, behind which soldiers could fight with considerable protection so long as the formation itself held firm. It was a defensive arrangement well suited to Harold's circumstances, allowing an exhausted army to fight from a position of natural strength, rather than risking an open engagement on ground more favorable to William's forces. William's army, arrayed below the ridge on the morning of the 14th of October, brought a different mix of capabilities to the coming battle, one built around combined arms in ways the purely infantry-based English force could not fully match. Norman infantry formed the initial line, supported by archers whose arrows could be loosed at range before any direct engagement began, and behind them waited the cavalry that represented perhaps William's single greatest tactical advantage. Mounted knights, trained for years in the kind of coordinated charges that had proven devastating across numerous continental battlefields, gave William options that Harold's foot-bound army simply could not replicate. The battle began in the morning and would stretch on for most of the day, an unusually long engagement by the standards of medieval warfare, where battles were often decided within an hour or two of fighting. Norman archers opened the engagement, loosing volleys uphill toward the English shield wall, though the steep angle limited their effectiveness considerably against a formation positioned above them. Norman infantry followed, advancing up the slope to test the English line directly, and found the shield wall holding firm against the initial assault, its discipline absorbing the attack without breaking in any significant way. William then committed his cavalry, sending mounted knights charging up the hill against the English position, and this assault too failed to break the shield wall in its early attempts. The steep ground blunted the momentum cavalry normally relied upon, and English housecarls, wielding their heavy axes with devastating effect against both horse and rider, inflicted serious casualties on the attacking Norman forces. At some point during this phase of the fighting, a rumor spread through the Norman ranks that William himself had been killed, a report that threatened to collapse the entire attacking force into panicked retreat before it had even secured a real foothold against the English line. William's response to this crisis has been cited by historians ever since as a moment of genuine battlefield leadership under enormous pressure. He reportedly removed his helmet, raising it, and showing his face to his own retreating soldiers, riding along the lines to demonstrate personally that he remained alive and that the rumor sweeping through his ranks was false. This gesture, simple as it sounds, arrested what could have become a catastrophic collapse of Norman morale, rallying his forces and allowing the assault on the English position to continue, rather than dissolving into disorganized flight back toward the ships at Hastings. As the battle continued into the afternoon, a pattern began to emerge that would prove decisive to the day's eventual outcome, whether through deliberate Norman tactics or through fortunate accident born of genuine battlefield chaos, a question historians continue to debate without full resolution. Portions of William's forces, perhaps Breton troops on one flank, appeared to break and flee downhill in apparent panic, and a portion of the English line, seeing what looked like a genuine rout developing, broke formation to pursue the fleeing attackers down the slope. This proved catastrophic for the pursuing English soldiers, who found themselves suddenly exposed on open ground, separated from the protective density of the shield wall, and vulnerable to Norman cavalry that turned and cut them down with brutal efficiency. Whether this retreat was a genuine accident that William's forces simply exploited once they recognized the opportunity, or a calculated feigned flight deployed deliberately to draw the English out of their strong defensive position, remains genuinely uncertain, given how sources from this period tend to shade tactical narratives toward whichever outcome later flattered the victors. What is clear is that the pattern repeated itself more than once as the afternoon wore on, with portions of the English line drawn away from the main formation each time, weakening the shield wall's overall integrity a little further with every repetition. Harold's army, still fighting with the exhaustion of Stamford Bridge and the forced march south weighing on them, could not fully compensate for these repeated losses along its edges. By late afternoon, the shield wall that had held so firmly through the earlier hours of fighting had begun to thin and fracture in ways that opened genuine opportunities for William's forces to press their advantage more directly. Norman infantry and cavalry began finding gaps in the English formation that simply had not existed earlier in the day, and the character of the battle shifted gradually from a contest over a nearly impregnable defensive line towards something closer to a grinding struggle against an increasingly vulnerable and depleted force. The housecarls at the center of the English position continued fighting with the same discipline and ferocity that had marked the entire day, but the army around them was steadily losing the structural integrity that had made it so difficult to break earlier. Harold's death, when it finally came sometime in the late afternoon or early evening, marked the true turning point of the battle, the moment after which English resistance began to collapse in earnest rather than simply weaken at the edges. The exact circumstances of his death remain debated among historians, complicated considerably by the famous image on the Bayeux tapestry that appears to show a figure struck in the eye by an arrow, labeled as Harold, alongside another nearby figure being cut down by a mounted knight. Some scholars argue the tapestry depicts a single death shown in sequence. others that it shows two entirely separate figures, and the ambiguity has never been fully resolved by surviving evidence from either side of the conflict. Whatever the precise manner of his death, Harold's fall removed the central figure around whom English resistance had organized itself throughout the long day of fighting, and without him, the cohesion of the English army began to disintegrate rapidly. Some housecarls and loyal retainers continued fighting fiercely around his body, determined to protect their fallen king, even as the broader battle was clearly slipping beyond recovery, a final display of the same discipline that had characterized the shield wall throughout the earlier hours. Their resistance, however determined, could not reverse what Harold's death had already set in motion across the wider field. As dusk settled over Senlac Hill, the English army that had fought so hard through the day finally broke apart in earnest, soldiers scattering from a position that no longer had any coherent leadership holding it together. Norman forces pursued the retreating English through the gathering darkness, though pursuit in failing light across unfamiliar terrain carried its own dangers, and some pockets of English resistance apparently inflicted losses on overeager Norman pursuers who pressed too far into difficult ground without adequate caution. The battle, by any measure, had ended in decisive Norman victory, but it had not been the swift or easy triumph that hindsight sometimes makes it appear to have been. The cost of the day's fighting had been severe on both sides, a fact easy to lose sight of given how completely the battle's outcome would eventually reshape English history. Norman losses, while considerably lighter than the devastation inflicted on the English side, were still significant enough that William's army emerged from Hastings weakened rather than triumphant in any simple, unqualified sense. The English losses, by contrast, were catastrophic, stripping the kingdom of Harold himself, along with a substantial portion of its most experienced military leadership and its elite housecarl warriors, men whose skill and training could not be quickly or easily replaced. For William, victory at Hastings represented the single most consequential achievement of his entire life to that point, surpassing even the hard-won triumph at Val-ès-Dunes decades earlier in its scale and its stakes. He had crossed open water to invade a foreign kingdom, faced an experienced and well-positioned defensive army, and emerged from a long and genuinely uncertain day of fighting as the master of the field. Yet Hastings alone did not make William King of England, whatever the symbolic weight of Harold's death carried with it. The crown itself remained unclaimed, London remained unconquered, and a great deal of hard, uncertain work still stood between William and the throne he had crossed the Channel to seize. The Norman army rested briefly on the battlefield before William began the next phase of his campaign, understanding clearly that Hastings had opened a path toward the English crown without yet delivering it into his hands. English resistance, though badly wounded by the loss of Harold and so many of his finest warriors, had not entirely collapsed, and pockets of nobility in London and elsewhere still had to be persuaded or forced to accept Norman rule. What had begun as a contested claim pursued through diplomacy, papal appeal, and finally invasion, now entered its final and in some ways most delicate phase, the actual conquest and pacification of a kingdom that had just lost its king, but had not yet fully lost its will to resist. Chapter 11. The March on London. Victory at Hastings had cost William something in blood and time, even as it delivered him an overwhelming strategic advantage, and he understood well enough that neither could simply be spent recklessly in the days that followed. His army rested briefly on the battlefield, tending wounded and burying dead, while William weighed how best to convert a single decisive battle into the actual submission of a kingdom that still, technically, possessed no king at all, and no unified command structure willing to negotiate on its behalf. London, the largest and most important city in England, remained untouched by Norman arms, and its cooperation, whether given freely or extracted by force, would prove essential to any lasting claim on the throne. Rather than marching directly on London in the immediate aftermath of Hastings, William chose a more circuitous route, moving first to secure Dover and other strategic points along the southeastern coast, before turning his attention toward the capital itself. Dover surrendered with minimal resistance, its garrison recognizing the futility of holding against an army that had just annihilated England's most formidable military force at Hastings. William's forces occupied the town, reportedly causing some damage during the process that later chroniclers attributed to overzealous soldiers rather than deliberate policy, and William moved to make amends where he judged it useful for maintaining the appearance of a conqueror who preferred order to chaos. The English nobility who had survived Hastings, along with the clergy and remaining political figures of consequence in London, faced their own difficult calculations in the weeks following Harold's death. Edgar the Atheling, the teenage grandson of a former English king whose claim had been passed over in favor of Harold's election the previous January, was proclaimed king by some remaining members of the Wheaton, a gesture that reflected desperation more than genuine confidence in Edgar's ability to actually resist William's advancing army. He was young, inexperienced, and lacked any meaningful military force capable of contesting Norman arms, and his brief nominal kingship amounted to little more than a symbolic holdout against the inevitable. William's approach to London itself unfolded with the same combination of calculated brutality and strategic patience that had characterized his earlier campaigns in Normandy against Domfront and Alençon decades before. Rather than attempting a direct assault on a heavily fortified and populous city, he instead began a systematic campaign of devastation across the surrounding countryside, burning and raiding through Kent, Sussex, and the home counties in a wide arc that gradually encircled London and cut it off from meaningful outside support. This was not random pillaging conducted for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy aimed at demonstrating to London's remaining leadership exactly what continued resistance would cost the wider population. The devastation moved through Surrey and along the route toward Winchester and Wallingford, where William secured the crossing of the Thames and began positioning his forces to approach London from a direction the city's defenders may not have fully anticipated. Wallingford proved significant beyond its strategic value as a river crossing, since it was there that Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most senior remaining figures in the English Church, submitted to William and offered his allegiance. Stigand's submission carried weight beyond his personal authority, signaling to other wavering nobles and clergy that continued resistance was becoming an increasingly isolated and precarious position. As William's forces continued their encircling advance, additional English nobles began arriving to offer their submission, rather than waiting for Norman soldiers to arrive at their own doorsteps with fire and sword. This pattern of nobles calculating that early submission offered better terms than resistance followed by eventual defeat would recur repeatedly throughout William's consolidation of England in the years ahead, but its first significant appearance came during these tense weeks between Hastings and London's eventual surrender. Fear, mixed with pragmatic calculation about which side actually held the advantage, proved a powerful motivator among men who had just watched England's finest army destroyed in a single day's fighting. Edgar the Atheling's brief claim to the throne collapsed as swiftly as it had been raised, undermined by the steady stream of nobles choosing submission over continued resistance, and by the simple absence of any military force capable of backing his nominal kingship with actual strength. By early December, the remaining leadership in London, recognizing that further resistance offered nothing but continued devastation of the surrounding countryside without any realistic prospect of reversing the military situation, made the decision to submit to William rather than face a direct Norman assault on the city itself. This was not surrender born of genuine loyalty or conviction. It was surrender born of exhausted calculation, a recognition that the war had already been effectively decided at Hastings, even if the formal submission had taken weeks longer to arrive. William entered London in early December, received the submission of its leading citizens, clergy, and remaining nobility, and began the process of transforming a military conquest into something resembling a legitimate transfer of royal authority. This transformation mattered enormously to William's broader project, since a kingdom held purely by continued military occupation offered a far less stable foundation than one where the conqueror could present himself, however imperfectly, as the rightful and properly consecrated king, rather than a foreign occupier ruling by naked force alone. Coronation, conducted with appropriate ceremony and by figures whose authority the English population would recognize as legitimate, became the essential next step in this transformation. The coronation was set for Christmas Day 1066, and the location chosen carried deliberate symbolic weight that would not have been lost on anyone familiar with recent English history. Westminster Abbey, the very building whose completion Edward the Confessor had lived just long enough to witness, and where Harold himself had been crowned less than a year earlier following Edward's death, now became the site of William's own coronation, a physical and ceremonial link binding the new Norman king to the legitimate line of English royal succession he claimed to be continuing rather than violently interrupting. The ceremony itself, conducted according to accounts that survive from the period, proceeded with the traditional elements expected of an English royal coronation, including the customary acclamation in which those present were asked, in both English and Norman French given the mixed nature of the assembled crowd, whether they accepted William as their rightful king. This bilingual element reflected the genuinely mixed character of the gathering, English nobles and clergy standing alongside William's Norman lords and soldiers, two populations brought together in a single ceremony that none of them could have fully anticipated navigating together just months earlier. What happened next, according to several chroniclers, revealed something uncomfortable about the underlying tension still present beneath the ceremony's surface legitimacy. The shouts of acclamation from inside the abbey, loud and enthusiastic as medieval coronation customs demanded, were apparently misinterpreted by Norman soldiers stationed outside the building as signs of a riot or attack against William taking place within. These soldiers, according to the accounts, responded by setting fire to nearby buildings, creating a genuine panic that disrupted the solemnity of the coronation ceremony itself, with parts of the assembled crowd fleeing the abbey even as William was being formally crowned inside. The chaos of that moment, whatever its precise details, captured something true about the fragile and uncertain foundation on which William's new kingship actually rested, regardless of the careful ceremonial legitimacy the ceremony had been designed to project. Here was a coronation meant to demonstrate continuity and rightful succession, disrupted by exactly the kind of violent misunderstanding that reflected the genuine mutual suspicion still separating conquerors from conquered only weeks after Hastings. William was crowned King of England that day, but the disorder surrounding the ceremony offered an early, uncomfortable preview of just how much work remained before that crown would sit securely and peacefully upon his head. William's coronation formally ended the immediate military crisis that had begun with his landing at Pevensey months earlier, but it resolved far less than the ceremony's grandeur might have suggested to observers unfamiliar with the realities still facing the new king. England was not yet pacified in any meaningful sense beyond the immediate submission of London and the surrounding regions. Large portions of the kingdom, particularly in the north and west, had scarcely been touched by Norman arms at all, and their eventual acceptance of William's rule remained an open question rather than a settled fact, simply because a coronation had taken place in Westminster Abbey. The new king faced immediate and practical challenges in the weeks following his coronation, chief among them the question of how to actually govern a kingdom whose language, customs, and legal traditions differed substantially from those of Normandy, and whose population vastly outnumbered the Norman and continental forces William had available to enforce his rule. He began distributing land and titles to the barons and knights who had supported the invasion, honoring the promises made months earlier when recruiting forces for the crossing, a process that would gradually but fundamentally reshape English landholding patterns over the following years. This redistribution, necessary as it was for rewarding William's supporters and establishing a loyal Norman presence across the kingdom, also planted seeds of resentment among displaced English landholders that would contribute to unrest in the years immediately ahead. William did not remain in England indefinitely following his coronation, recognizing that Normandy itself still required his attention and that an extended absence from the duchy carried its own risks, given the general pattern of instability that tended to emerge whenever a Norman ruler's attention shifted too fully elsewhere. He returned to Normandy in early 1067, leaving trusted regents behind to manage English affairs in his absence, a decision that reflected confidence in the military conquest achieved at Hastings, but perhaps underestimated how quickly that confidence would be tested by renewed English resistance once William's own commanding presence was no longer immediately felt across the kingdom. The England William left behind in early 1067 was a kingdom conquered in the most immediate military sense, its crown secured through a coronation conducted with appropriate ceremony despite the disorder that had marred its conclusion, but it remained far from truly subdued in any deeper or more lasting sense. Regions across the north and west watched developments from a distance, uncommitted to either active resistance or genuine acceptance of Norman rule, waiting to see how firmly William's grip would actually hold once tested by circumstances beyond a single decisive battle and a hastily conducted coronation ceremony. That test would not be long in coming, and the years immediately following William's departure would prove considerably more difficult than the swift campaign that had brought him to Westminster Abbey in the first place. Chapter 12: A Kingdom Not Yet Won. William's return to Normandy in early 1067 was, in one sense, a victory lap, an opportunity to display the wealth and prestige gained through the conquest of England to a duchy that had funded and fought for the campaign. He brought English hostages and treasure with him, tangible proof that the enormous gamble of crossing the Channel had paid off in ways even his own barons might not have fully anticipated. Norman churches received gifts, celebrations marked the triumph, and for a brief period the new King of England could enjoy something resembling the fruits of his achievement, rather than the constant vigilance that had defined so much of his life to that point. That vigilance, however, was never truly absent for long, and events in England during William's absence made clear just how premature any sense of settled triumph actually was. The regents left behind to govern in his name, chief among them his half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, and William Fitz-Osbern, faced a kingdom whose submission at London had never extended with equal firmness to every corner of the realm. Norman authority remained, in practical terms, concentrated around the south and the immediate approaches to London, thin or entirely absent across large stretches of territory further north and west. Resistance began emerging in scattered pockets almost as soon as William's personal presence no longer loomed over the kingdom to discourage it. Exeter in the southwest became one of the earliest significant flashpoints, its citizens refusing to fully accept Norman demands and eventually facing a siege when William, informed of the growing defiance, returned to England to deal with it personally in 1068. The city held out for a period before eventually submitting, and William's treatment of Exeter afterward reflected a calculated moderation rather than the brutal reprisal he had shown decades earlier at Alençon, a choice that suggests he understood the value of demonstrating that submission, even delayed, could still be met with reasonable terms. Further north, resistance took a more serious and sustained form, centered particularly around York and the broader region of Northumbria, an area with a long history of resisting centralized authority, regardless of whether that authority originated from London or from Normandy. Local uprisings flared with troubling regularity through 1068 and into 1069, sometimes suppressed by Norman forces only to reignite again once those forces moved elsewhere to address the next emerging crisis. This pattern of scattered, recurring rebellion proved considerably harder to manage than a single decisive battle, since it denied William the kind of clear, conclusive engagement that had settled matters so thoroughly at Hastings. The North's resistance drew strength from more than simple regional stubbornness, and outside actors soon recognized the opportunity that ongoing English unrest presented. King Sweyn II of Denmark, related by blood to the earlier Scandinavian rulers of England, and never entirely reconciled to Norman control over a kingdom his own dynasty had once held, began exploring the possibility of intervention, sensing in Northumbrian discontent a chance to press Danish interests in England once again. This external dimension transformed what might otherwise have remained purely internal English unrest into something with genuinely dangerous international implications for William's still fragile hold on the kingdom. Edgar the Atheling, whose brief nominal kingship had collapsed so quickly in the aftermath of Hastings, remained a persistent figure around whom English resistance could theoretically organize, a living reminder of the pre-conquest royal line that some segments of the population had never fully abandoned hope of restoring. He fled to Scotland at various points during this period, finding refuge and occasional support from King Malcolm III, whose own relationship with the new Norman regime in England remained cautious and unresolved. Edgar's continued presence as a potential rallying point complicated William's efforts to present Norman rule as an uncontested, settled fact, rather than an ongoing contest, still being actively decided. Perhaps the most storied resistance to emerge during this turbulent period centered around the fens of eastern England, a landscape of marsh and waterway that offered natural defensive advantages against conventional military campaigns. Hereward, later remembered in English tradition as Hereward the Wake, led a sustained resistance movement based around the Isle of Ely, using the difficult terrain to harass Norman forces and maintain a genuine center of English defiance well into the early 1070s. The details of Hereward's actual campaign have been heavily embellished by later legend, making it genuinely difficult for historians to separate documented fact from the romanticized folk hero he eventually became in English storytelling. William's response to this scattered but persistent resistance evolved considerably as the pattern of rebellion continued to frustrate any hope of quick, permanent pacification. Early responses had sometimes favored the kind of measured moderation shown at Exeter, an approach that assumed reasonable terms might eventually secure lasting loyalty from a defeated population. As uprisings continued recurring despite these measured responses, however, William's patience wore thinner, and the approach he would eventually adopt toward the most persistently rebellious regions began shifting toward something considerably harsher than anything seen in the immediate aftermath of Hastings itself. The constant need to shuttle between England and Normandy placed enormous strain on William personally during these years, a reality that later chroniclers sometimes glossed over in favor of narratives emphasizing his conquest's completeness and finality. He crossed the Channel repeatedly through 1068 and 1069, responding to fresh outbreaks of rebellion in one region only to receive word of renewed trouble elsewhere, a pattern that must have tested even his considerable reserves of patience and energy. Normandy itself could not simply be neglected during these years either, since the duchy's own stability remained essential to William's ability to draw resources and reinforcements for his ongoing English campaigns. Castle building emerged as one of William's primary tools for managing this ongoing instability, a strategy drawn directly from lessons learned decades earlier during his own consolidation of ducal authority in Normandy. Motte and Bailey fortifications rose across England at a remarkable pace during these years, physical symbols of Norman power planted in contested or newly subdued territory, garrisoned by Norman soldiers capable of projecting force into the surrounding countryside and responding quickly to signs of renewed unrest. These castles served a purpose beyond pure military utility, standing as constant, visible reminders to the local population of exactly whose authority now governed the land around them. The financial burden of maintaining ongoing military campaigns across a kingdom, still resisting full pacification, fell heavily on the English population, a fact that contributed its own share of resentment, feeding the very unrest William was struggling to suppress. Taxation increased substantially to fund the garrisons, castles, and continued military operations necessary to hold contested regions, and this economic pressure landed disproportionately on English landholders and peasants who had already lost considerable status and property in the redistribution following the initial conquest. Resistance, in other words, was not purely a matter of loyalty to a fallen dynasty or resentment of foreign rule in the abstract. It was fed, in very concrete terms, by the immediate economic hardship Norman consolidation imposed on ordinary people trying to survive within it. By 1069, the accumulated weight of scattered rebellion, Danish intervention, and persistent northern defiance had created a situation William could no longer address through the piecemeal, region-by-region responses that had characterized the previous 2 years. A major uprising centered on York, coinciding with the arrival of a substantial Danish fleet sent by Sweden II in support of English resistance, represented perhaps the most serious single threat to Norman control since Hastings itself. Norman garrisons in York were overwhelmed, and for a period the north slipped almost entirely beyond effective Norman authority, a genuine crisis that demanded a response far more decisive and far more severe than anything William had previously attempted. This convergence of threats, arriving together rather than in the more manageable sequence of the previous years, forced William toward a reckoning with the fundamental problem underlying all of his difficulties in the north. Measured responses and selective castle building had failed to secure lasting peace in a region whose population, geography, and historical independence from Southern English authority made it uniquely resistant to conventional pacification. Something more comprehensive would be required if Norman rule was ever to extend with genuine security across the entirety of the kingdom William had claimed at Westminster Abbey 3 years earlier. The winter of 1069 into 1070 would become, in the years that followed, one of the most infamous periods of William's entire reign, remembered long after his other achievements had faded into the general texture of medieval history. What began as another response to yet another round of northern rebellion would escalate into something categorically different from the castle building and measured sieges that had characterized William's approach up to this point. The scale of what he was about to unleash across Yorkshire and the surrounding region would leave scars on the northern landscape and its population that outlasted William's own life by generations, a campaign remembered not for tactical brilliance, but for a devastation so thorough it would come to define, in the eyes of many later historians, the darkest chapter of William's entire reign. Chapter 13: The Harrying of the North. William moved north in the winter of 1069, ready to end the cycle of rebellion once and for all. The immediate crisis involved a major uprising backed by Danish ships. He dealt with the Danes first, paying them enough to withdraw and abandon the English rebels. That solved the external threat. What came next was something else entirely. Historians call it the harrying of the North. It was not a battle. It was a deliberate campaign to destroy the region's ability to ever rebel again. Villages burned across wide stretches of Yorkshire. This was not the ordinary damage of a passing army. Even Norman chroniclers, writing for a king they served, described it with something close to horror. Livestock were slaughtered or driven off by the thousands. This stripped the region of more than food. It stripped away any hope of quick recovery. Seed grain meant for next year's planting was destroyed too. Stored food went with it. The campaign was not just punishment, it was engineered famine. Orderic Vitalis, a chronicler writing decades later, did not hold back. Even from within the Norman tradition, he judged William harshly for this one. That alone says something. Most chroniclers of the age accepted brutal warfare as normal. This crossed a line even they could recognize. The suffering did not end when the soldiers moved on. Burned fields and dead livestock meant famine, and famine spread through the winter and into the following year. No one can say exactly how many died. The number from starvation likely dwarfed the number killed in the fighting itself. Some accounts describe survivors eating dogs and cats. A few grim reports mention cannibalism, born of pure desperation. The scale of the damage shows up clearly 17 years later in the Domesday Book. Great stretches of Yorkshire are marked simply as waste. That word meant land stripped of people and unable to produce anything. It was not a record built to document atrocity. It was a tax survey, and still the devastation shows through plainly. Why did William order this? The North had defied him for 3 years straight. Castles and careful military response had failed to hold it. He seems to have concluded that only total destruction would end the pattern, burn the region's ability to survive, and rebellion becomes impossible. It is a brutal kind of logic, but it was logic all the same. This was not new behavior from William. Decades earlier at Alençon, he had mutilated townspeople who mocked his birth. The goal there was deterrence through memorable cruelty. The harrying followed the same instinct, only scaled up enormously. Burned villages and starvation replaced severed hands and feet. The message was the same either way. Did it work? The North never rose in serious rebellion again after 1070. In that narrow sense, yes, it worked. But recovery took generations, not years. The economic and demographic damage shaped Yorkshire for centuries. Whatever peace followed came at an enormous, lasting cost. The moral weight of this episode has followed William ever since. This was not violence against armed men in open battle. That kind of warfare medieval chroniclers mostly accepted without comment. This was different. It targeted civilians directly, aiming at their basic ability to survive at all. Some historians place the harrying within a broader pattern. Scorched earth tactics were not unique to William. Other medieval rulers used similar methods elsewhere in Europe. That context is worth knowing. It does not make Yorkshire's suffering any smaller or any easier to look past. What did William himself think about it? The sources do not say much. Norman chroniclers mostly avoided the subject, preferring to focus on the pacification it achieved rather than its cost. Orderic Vitalis, writing later and with more distance, hints at real unease. Even among William's own supporters, something about this campaign did not sit easily. Looking back, the harrying reveals something that had shadowed William since childhood. He grew up watching loyalty collapse under pressure, watching mercy invite only more danger. That boy became a king willing to destroy an entire region rather than risk further rebellion. It was not the first time this instinct shaped his choices. It would not be the last, but nothing else in his reign shows it quite this starkly. By spring of 1070, the immediate crisis had passed. It ended not through peace or reconciliation, but through devastation so complete that resistance simply became impossible. William turned next toward governing what remained of the kingdom. The methods that secured this control would outlast his reign by centuries, remembered as the darkest chapter of an otherwise triumphant conquest. Chapter 14: Iron Rule. With the North subdued, William turned to a different kind of work. He began reorganizing the entire kingdom under Norman structures. This task would prove just as consequential as the conquest itself. England by the 1070s looked nothing like the kingdom Harold had governed. Almost the entire English aristocracy had been displaced by this point. Their lands went to Norman barons, knights, and clergy who had backed the invasion. This did not happen through any single decree. It accumulated gradually, accelerated by wave after wave of rebellion, each uprising giving William fresh justification to confiscate estates from lords he judged disloyal. By the mid-1070s, only a handful of great English landholders remained. Even they held their positions at William's pleasure. Their claims were no longer secure or independent. The English nobility, as a class capable of rivaling Norman power, had essentially ceased to exist. In its place rose a feudal structure William had spent decades refining back in Normandy. Land was held from the king in exchange for military service. Barons then granted portions of that land to knights who owed service in turn. This gave William something Anglo-Saxon England had never quite managed: a standing military obligation spread across the whole kingdom. Castles became permanent fixtures of the English landscape. They were no longer temporary wartime tools. The Tower of London, begun during these years, stood as the clearest symbol of this shift. A massive stone fortress rose inside the capital itself, and smaller fortifications spread across the countryside too. William's relationship with the church changed just as dramatically. Lanfranc, his trusted advisor since the marriage dispute decades earlier, became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070. He replaced Stigand, whose earlier submission at Wallingford had not been enough to save him. Under Lanfranc, senior church posts increasingly went to Norman or continental clergy instead of Englishmen. This mirrored what was happening across the secular kingdom at the same time. Norman bishops brought continental building styles with them. Great cathedrals rose during this period, many of them still standing today. English religious life was being remade in stone, chapel by chapel, diocese by diocese. No single project captures Norman ambition better than the Domesday Book. William ordered it in 1085, and commissioners finished it the following year. The survey recorded landholders, land values, livestock, and resources across nearly the whole kingdom, in a level of detail that stunned contemporaries. Historians still marvel at it today. Commissioners traveled the country gathering information from local juries. These were sworn groups familiar with each area's land and history. The records were compiled with a thoroughness that left almost no room for dispute. People began calling it Domesday, a nod to the Last Judgment since its verdicts were treated as final. What the survey revealed was stark. English landholders now controlled only a small fraction of the kingdom's land. Most of it had passed into Norman hands over the previous 2 decades. Yorkshire's wastelands, recorded plainly in the survey, stood as permanent proof of the harrying years earlier. The Domesday Project revealed something about William himself, too. His rule by the 1080s had grown methodical, almost obsessive about documentation. This marked a real shift from his earlier reign in England. Early on, William had reacted to crises as they came. By the 1080s, he governed through careful, comprehensive control instead. Royal justice grew more sophisticated during these years as well. Clearer procedures emerged for settling disputes between subjects. Norman legal ideas began blending with existing English common law. This blend would keep evolving long after William's death, forming a foundation later English law would build upon. None of this worked without the Norman barons William had installed across the kingdom. Their loyalty rested on land and titles, but loyalty alone was never quite enough to guarantee peace. Some barons grew powerful enough in their new holdings to worry William, and that tension would surface more seriously after his death. By the mid-1080s, England was barely recognizable next to the kingdom Harold had briefly ruled. Its landholding, its church, its castles, its courts, all carried the clear mark of Norman reorganization. William had done more than win a single battle at Hastings. He had rebuilt the institutional skeleton of an entire kingdom. That skeleton would outlast him by centuries. Even as this achievement reached its peak in the Domesday Survey, William himself was aging. His life, since Falaise, had been one long fight against assassins and rebels. Now the plain difficulty of holding 2 lands together across the Channel weighed on him just as heavily. Old rivalries with France still simmered, unresolved even as his English government reached its most refined form. William had spent nearly 2 decades perfecting the machinery of a conquered kingdom, but a king could not simply retire from old enemies. One last campaign against a familiar rival still waited for him. Chapter 15: The Fall at Mantes and the Reckoning. The final years of William's reign carried him back, again and again, to conflicts along Normandy's borders. Chief among these was his old rivalry with the Kingdom of France. King Philip I, once a minor ward of regents, had grown into a ruler with his own ambitions. He watched Norman strength with the same wariness his predecessors had shown decades earlier. Tension between William and Philip centered on the French Vexin, a contested border region that had long troubled relations between Normandy and the French crown. The town of Mantes sat within this disputed territory, close enough to Norman lands to matter enormously to William's sense of security. Philip's forces had been raiding into Norman territory from this direction, and William, now in his late 50s, could not simply ignore the provocation. His body was aging, but his instinct for defending Norman borders had not softened at all. There is a story, repeated by several chroniclers, that Philip mocked William during this period, making some remark about the Norman king's increasing weight and physical decline. William, according to these accounts, responded with characteristic fury, promising that he would light such a fire at his own churching, referring to a ceremonial mass, that Philip would feel its heat across the Channel. Whether the exchange happened exactly as described matters less than what it reveals. William's pride, forged through decades of hard survival, had not diminished with age. In the summer of 1087, William led a campaign into the Vexin, targeting Mantes directly as retaliation for Philip's border raids. His forces took the town and set it ablaze, continuing the pattern of calculated destruction that had marked so much of his career, from Alençon decades earlier to the harrying of Yorkshire years before. Fire had always been one of William's preferred instruments, both as punishment and as message. Mantes burned thoroughly under his command. It was during this campaign, amid the heat and chaos of the burning town, that William suffered the injury that would ultimately end his life. Accounts differ on the precise details, but most describe his horse rearing or stumbling over hot ash or debris in the ruined streets. William was thrown forward against the pommel of his saddle with considerable force. The impact caused severe internal injuries, the kind that 11th century medicine had almost no capacity to treat effectively. William was carried from Mantes back toward Rouen, the city that had served as one of Normandy's key seats of power since long before his birth. His condition worsened steadily during the journey and the weeks that followed, and it became increasingly clear to those around him that this injury was not one he would recover from. The king, who had survived assassination attempts as a child, who had crossed open water to conquer a foreign kingdom, now faced an ending far less dramatic than any battlefield death. A stumbling horse in a burning town would finish what decades of enemies had failed to accomplish. William spent his final weeks at the Priory of Saint-Gervais, just outside Rouen, attended by clergy and by whatever family members and household officials remained close enough to reach him. His sons were scattered across his territories, managing their own affairs and, in some cases, their own rivalries with each other and with their aging father. Robert, his eldest son, had a notably strained relationship with William, having rebelled against him years earlier over questions of inheritance and authority. That tension would matter enormously in the days ahead. As death approached, William turned his attention to the question that had shadowed rulers of his era constantly: what would become of his lands once he was gone? He held Normandy as duke and England as king, two territories bound together only by his own person rather than by any formal, permanent union. There was no guarantee they would remain connected after his death, and William's decisions in his final days would determine exactly how his conquests were divided among his sons. He granted Normandy to Robert, his eldest, despite the friction between them, honoring the traditional expectation that the firstborn son would inherit the family's original patrimony. England, by contrast, he left to William Rufus, his second surviving son, a decision that split the Anglo-Norman realm William had spent 2 decades building into a single unified holding. His youngest son, Henry, received a substantial sum of money rather than land, a decision that would prove significant far beyond what anyone could have predicted at the time. This division reflected William's own uncertainty about whether Normandy and England could realistically remain under a single ruler indefinitely, given the very different administrative and political demands each territory placed on whoever governed it. It also reflected the genuinely poor relationship between William and his eldest son, a relationship too damaged by years of rebellion and reconciliation to make Robert a fully trusted choice for the entirety of his father's conquests. Whatever the precise reasoning, the decision guaranteed that William's death would immediately create competing claims and divided loyalties among his own sons. William died on the 9th of September 1087 at the priory outside Rouen, surrounded by far fewer attendants than his status as king and duke might have suggested. According to several chroniclers, many of his household officials and even some of his own attendants abandoned his body almost immediately after his final breath, rushing instead to secure their own positions and properties before the news of his death could spread and complicate their interests. This abandonment was not simply callousness for its own sake. It reflected the genuine uncertainty and danger that always accompanied a medieval succession, when swift action often mattered more than propriety. The disorder surrounding William's death extended even to the handling of his own body, a detail chroniclers recorded with something between horror and grim fascination. His corpse was left unattended for a period, and accounts suggest it may have been stripped of some of its remaining valuables by those who had been present at his passing. This was an undignified ending for a man who had spent his entire life fighting to secure exactly the kind of authority and respect that seemed to evaporate the moment his authority could no longer enforce it. William's funeral, when it finally took place at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, the very church he and Matilda had built decades earlier as penance for their disputed marriage, proved similarly troubled. According to several accounts, complications arose during the burial itself, with William's body swollen from decomposition and the summer heat, not fitting properly into the stone sarcophagus prepared for it. The awkward, undignified scene that followed stood in stark contrast to the grandeur William had built around himself throughout his reign. Even his own funeral seemed to resist the order he had spent his life imposing on everything around him. Beyond the immediate chaos surrounding his death, William's passing set in motion decades of conflict among his own descendants, as Robert, William Rufus, and eventually Henry maneuvered against each other for control over Normandy, England, or ideally both. The division William had made in his final days did not settle the succession question so much as postpone it, guaranteeing that his sons would spend years contesting exactly the kind of unified Anglo-Norman authority their father had built through decades of war, calculation, and occasional brutality. Robert's Normandy and Rufus's England would eventually be reunited, though not until Henry, the youngest son who had received only money rather than land, outlasted and outmaneuvered his own brothers to claim both. Looking back across the full span of William's life, from the dangerous childhood in Falaise to the burning streets of Mantes, a consistent pattern emerges beneath all the individual episodes of triumph and brutality. This was a man shaped fundamentally by early exposure to betrayal, forced from childhood to treat loyalty as something that had to be earned, tested, and enforced rather than simply assumed. That lesson, learned amid murdered guardians and constant flight, echoed through everything he built afterward, from the consolidation of Normandy through the conquest of England to the iron administrative structures recorded so thoroughly in the Domesday Book. William's legacy extended far beyond his own lifetime, in ways he could not have fully anticipated even in his final days at Rouen. The Norman Conquest reshaped English language, law, architecture, and governance so thoroughly that its effects remained visible centuries later, embedded in institutions and traditions that continued evolving long after the last person who remembered William's actual reign had died. The castles he built, the survey he commissioned, the feudal structures he imposed, all persisted as the skeleton on which subsequent English history was built, whether his eventual successors honored his memory or simply inherited his achievements without much thought for the man who had created them. What remains most striking, perhaps, about William's life is the distance between its beginning and its end, a distance that says something true about the era he lived through. He began as an illegitimate child in a minor Norman town, protected by nothing but the reluctant oaths of frightened barons and the eventual intervention of a French king who needed a stable neighbor more than he wanted a genuine ally. He ended as the ruler of two territories, remembered as a conqueror whose name would attach itself permanently to the year 1066, even as his own body lay briefly abandoned by the men who owed him everything. Between those 2 points lay a life built almost entirely on the hard, unglamorous work of surviving betrayal and turning that survival again and again into lasting power. The stone at Caen has worn smoother now than it was on the day they finally closed it over him. Rain has found its way into the joints 1,000 times since, frozen there in winter, dried out again each spring. Nobody standing beside it today would know, just from looking, that the man inside once held 2 crowns and burned a town for an insult about his weight. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over old battlefields, once enough centuries have passed. Senlac Hill is farmland now, or close enough to it, sheep moving over ground that once ran with the panic of a broken shield wall. The ridge still rises the way it always did. The grass does not remember what stood on it in October of 1066. And neither really does the soil beneath, though something of that day is folded into the ground all the same, the way old violence tends to settle into land and simply stay there unspoken. Think of Yorkshire in the years after the burning, the fields slowly finding their way back to green. It takes a long time for land to forget what was done to it. Longer for people, but grass does not carry grudges the way men do, and eventually the wheat came back, and eventually children were born who never once heard firsthand what their grandparents had survived that winter. There is something almost merciful in how thoroughly time erases the texture of a life, even one as loud as William's. The fear he carried as a boy, listening to a guardian murdered in the dark beside him, the particular ache in his hands after a long day training with a sword he was too young by rights to be trusted with. None of that survives in any document. It survives only in the shape of what he later became, and even that shape has softened under the weight of 800 years. Consider for a moment an ordinary object from that world, a stirrup, rusted now, pulled from riverbank silt somewhere in Sussex. Whoever wore it once rode into the chaos near Hastings, one man among thousands, his name entirely lost. He does not appear in the Bayeux tapestry. He does not appear in any chronicle. He simply rode and fought, and either lived or did not, and the stirrup outlasted him by nearly a millennium, waiting quietly in the mud for someone to notice it. That is, in the end, what history leaves behind more often than not the names, not even the great stone tombs, worn smooth by centuries of rain, just small, stubborn fragments, a buckle, a coin, a length of iron shaped once by a hand that has been dust for 800 years, resting now in soil that has long since stopped keeping score. Somewhere tonight, rain is falling on that same Norman coastline, on the low hills above what used to be Dives, where a fleet once waited weeks for a wind that finally came. The water moves the same way it always has. It does not know what crossed it, or why, or what it cost the men who made the crossing. It simply moves, patient and indifferent, the way water always does, carrying nothing forward but itself.